Hi, it's 11:30. My name is Dr. Tracy Ortiz, and I am the moderator for this session. And I wanted to welcome you all. The session is being recorded, as you just heard, and we will be working on behalf of the ADEIL conference session. And I just want to thank you for joining us for Designing for Diversity, How to Unlock Educational Impact with Inclusive Learning Design. And I want to welcome Nandipha Sephuma, and she is going to carry on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to the session. Again, it's on Designing for Diversity, where we're going to try and explore how to unlock educational impact with inclusive learning design. This also happens to be my first ADEIL conference experience, so just really super excited to be here. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen. And just confirming that you can all see the presentation.
Yes, we can.
Yes, I can see it.
Awesome, thank you so much. So just to kick off a little bit about me, again, my name is Nandipha Sephuma, and you'll see from this slide that I have a background in English literature. And after my studies, I had the great fortune of stumbling into the field of learning design just by being in the right place at the right time. So very lucky there. Oops, sorry about that. Then, now I'm with Hubble Studios, which is a South African-based online learning agency that brings a global perspective to our partnerships with some of the best companies and higher education institutions in the US, in the UK, in South Africa, and just really around the world. And so these are some of the stakeholders that I've worked with. As we begin, I just want to reiterate for this session, I'd love for you to raise your digital hand when you'd like to ask a question or add a comment. I'll also try and keep up with the chat if that's what you prefer. We'll be keeping our mics off when you're not speaking, and in the interest of maximizing time, I may have to park some thoughts or questions for the Q&A session at the end, and we can use the chat function for that as well. What you'll see from the session that I've planned is that as a learning designer, I'm here sort of on a mining expedition. As part of Hubble Studios, we are experts at understanding what students need for impactful educational experiences, but I'd like to think faculty, educators, professors, support staff, and administration are experts in what your learners need. So I would aggressively welcome your experiences, and I think sharing our insights as educators, as instructors, as professors, support staff, and administrators, as well as instructional designers, will really close that gap, if you will, for us, and create a point of connection for you. And hopefully you'll also get as much out of this session as what you give. In terms of the agenda, some of the topics that I'd like us to dive into today, I'll be asking for your insights on who you design for, and asking you to really think about who is possibly left out of that or left behind when we're thinking about who we design for. Then we'll look at what we really mean by diversity, accessibility, and inclusion. And I want to see if we are sort of broadly on the same page about what these mean. And then finally, we'll focus on a few simple launch points for starting to design diverse, inclusive, accessible learning experiences and spaces. So just to jump right in brings me to my first question: who do you design for? When I asked myself this, I actually thought of my mom. One, because she's a great lady and working from home means that she's around all the time, so she's top of mind, but also because she's a lifelong educator who was a school principal in typically underserved communities. Sorry about that. So she was a school principal in typically underserved communities, and also because years and years ago, she applied to do a master's degree through a UK university. Now, We are in Botswana. She was in Botswana at the time. Botswana is in Southern Africa. And you can imagine a long time ago, this, doing this master's degree involved waiting for course materials to be made, then writing out assignments by hand, then posting these assignments to England to be graded. Now, okay, already you can tell obstacles upon barriers, upon blockers already. And, hopefully because this year's conference theme is around moving distance learning forward, that means we're sort of moving away from that kind of setup as much as possible. But then you also add the fact that she is a widowed working parent of 7 children doing this at the time. And, you won't really be surprised that she didn't get to complete the program despite getting some really good grades. So when we're thinking about who we design for, we have the concept of the implied or the imagined learner. We all do it as an experienced educator. You form some sort of nebulous idea in your head of who'll be doing this program or who you expect to walk into the classroom, right? Or you have data telling you exactly who they are. But then there's this other student who comes in and turns that idea upside down, who has challenges that you would have never imagined, or is a widowed working mom in her 50s in Botswana, in a class of young tech-savvy students. So given that, I'd like us to take a moment to reflect and share on that student that challenged or even tore up your idea of who the imagined student is for your program or for your classroom. The student who wasn't at the center of your approach, but that student changed the way you think. What assumptions did you have to confront when dealing with that student? And even more importantly, how did you react to those challenges? What did you change? Maybe what did you add or remove from your design or teaching practice when this student walked into your class or sent you this panicked email explaining the challenge they're facing, or the reason why they're not able to engage with your program as they would like to? So, if you'd like to share around who you design for and who that student was for you, the person who changed the way you think about your approach to design, I'd appreciate it if you raise your virtual hand and unmute yourself when I call your name. I'll also keep an eye on the chat if you'd like to share a question or comment there. So just a few minutes of us sharing. I'd like to learn from faculty about those stories that really challenge their process and their approach to design and teaching. It looks like Morelli has her hand up.
Thank you, Nandipha. This is actually something that I came across recently because of a faculty member that I'm working with. When we were discussing the design for his course, he told me of all the ways that he would be able to cheat. And so he kept telling me about his in-person classes where everything was faith-based, that if he gave students readings, if he prescribed videos to watch and exercises to do, there wasn't necessarily any way for him to gauge, have they actually done the work or are they just turning up for lectures and kind of zoning out? And so it meant that I had to be creative to kind of catch all of the students who were hoping to kind of get the information fed to them, as well as all the students who would just skip lessons because it was maybe a little bit too challenging or a little bit too easy. And so it means that now when I design, I have to account for the lowest common denominator because it's quite complex. He uses a lot of calculations and formula. But I also have to consider the student who is just going to kind of skip all of the material because it's so easy for them. And I have to build in lots of ways to incentivize them to actually complete the work. Thanks for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Morelli. So one of the assumptions that, is we need to work with and is being challenged is that our imagined student or our implied learner wants to be there. That's an assumption that we make about, the people who are in our programs or the people who walk into our classrooms. And sometimes either they don't want to be there or they can't be there for various reasons. One of the major ones being technological challenges. So that is definitely something that's challenging who we consider as the imagined learner. Does anyone else have a perspective to share?
I'll jump in if that's okay.
Great, thank you.
You bet. I think of classes where I've taught of required text, and maybe there's like third-party quizzes or tools or something in there. And for most of the students, they're able to acquire it just fine. But occasionally there'll be maybe someone missed that there's a third-party thing that comes with new and purchased a used version of the text. And then all of a sudden they're having difficulty acquiring those materials and just trying to make a course that is supportive of students who encounter those situations where for whatever reason, again, most of the students, they get it just fine, but there'll be a couple students who for whatever reason, like they're just encountering difficulties and finding ways to support them.
Absolutely, yeah. So thank you so much. So there's challenges that we can anticipate that learners will encounter, and there's challenges that we really can't imagine. And so, as Mireli also mentioned, how do we adapt to that? How do we flex our approach? How do we design for some of those challenges ahead of time? And also leave flexibility during delivery or implementation of a course to allow us to respond to those challenges when they're fed back. I'm just checking in on the chat. I haven't seen any new messages at the moment. So anyone, just 2 or 3 more minutes for us to share.
There is a comment by Susan, learners with disabilities. She added to the chat.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Yeah, so as we are finding different ways to deliver content and programs, there are different physical and cognitive barriers to learning that learners have to contend with. Dr. Claudine, I see your hand is up.
Yes, hi. I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Tidewater Community College. And I'm really happy that you all are having this session. I came as a learner to learn and so that I may continue to share information, and I am enjoying the questions, right? Who do we design for? I often observe that designing courses, and I also used to teach in higher ed for 13 years. And so I know that often we design our courses based on our interest, right? If we love psychology, we design our courses based on those principles and methodology that we enjoy and that we like. One of the things that is becoming very important is to make sure that we're diversifying some of the, yeah, exactly that as well. I'm looking at the comment, but some of the things that are important is making sure that we're keeping the students in mind. And with the changing tide of demographics, I am observing that is something that we're having, faculty often have a challenging time with extending, teaching what you love, and also thinking about other people and how they learn this information as well. So those learning styles.
I'm not sure if you got cut off there, Claudine, but yeah, absolutely, super insightful comment. Thank you for that. So I love the phrase, the changing tide of demographics. So demographics themselves are not fixed categories. The categories that we have to consider in design are not fixed. So we're constantly having to grapple with what we know about our, not just that the imagined learner is different, but also that they themselves are changing. Just a few comments in the chat as well. So second language learners come to mind. Absolutely. You know, we have second language learners that represent some of the changing tide in demographics as more and more underrepresented students hopefully are making their way into these institutions. Again, another comment on third-party tools and the problem that they pose for students who are using assistive technologies. Of course, we are trying to design accessibility into our courses, but if we're using third-party tools, they may not be, you know, working to the same goals. And then Tracy's contribution, a reflection of the demographics of students who may be in the course, of course. And yeah, agreed. It's a very important point. So thank you so much. So I think sort of what's emerging from this discussion is that we like to think we know our imagined learner, but it's super important to also consider the learner that we're not talking about, the learner that doesn't immediately come to mind and unfortunately only comes to our awareness when there's a problem, when there's a challenge. And how do we build that process of expanding our idea of the imagined or implied learner in our courses? So I think this discussion is so important because, you know, as I mentioned earlier, as a learning designer, I often have to, you know, work with learning descriptions of a target learner that we are given from clients, for example, and even this is filtered through the idea of what the client or the institution thinks the learner will be. So these kinds of discussions with educators, with instructors, gives us a more rounded view of what challenges, you know, learners are really dealing with and what we have to design for and around. So just to move on, the next question that I want to address is, do we know what we really mean? You know, at Havel Studios, it's important to us that our courses are accessible and inclusive spaces for all students. And I'm sure that's the same for every one of us in this room. That's partly why we're here today. And in our design approach, we work to acknowledge the multiplicity of perspectives and abilities that students bring with them to virtual learning environments. But then when we have conversations with clients about our choices in approach or design, we also have to be clear about what we mean when we're talking about diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. So this is true for any practitioners. And here again, as a learning designer, I'd like to mine your insights, just as, you know, Claudine is a learner, is coming from a student's perspective. We have some faculty here, we have some administrators here. So I'd like to mine your insights around, so we as an organization, we've done a lot of thinking internally about these topics, but we also need to be super responsive to how understandings of these issues change. I'd like to go through some basic ideas and concepts around diversity, inclusion, and accessibility that I'm familiar with from working with Professor Lionel Paolela, who is a professor at the Cambridge Judge Business School, and he is an associate professor of strategy and organizational management, but he does a lot of work in the area of inclusion, diversity, and equity. So based on some of the work that I've done with him, I would also like to expand my understanding of these topics through your contributions and on any insights that can enrich our definitions. So when it comes to diversity, what do we mean? How do we understand, what do we understand by diversity? And again, please feel free to drop any definitions or key concepts in the chat, and I'll read out a few in a bit. Just to get us started, some of the concepts that come to my mind include ideas about the way in which people differ, and our approach to embracing and respecting our students' unique experiences, cultures, and identities, and their perspectives. So we're talking about dimensions of difference, such as sex and gender differences, differences in socioeconomic status, you know, differences in religion or beliefs, race, ethnicity or cultural differences, and differences in ability. So these are sort of the big five identified dimensions of difference identified by David Mitchell. And so with diversity, we're trying to create spaces where people with varied backgrounds and identities have voice and agency. So I'm just going to pause quickly and check if anyone has insight into what we can add to this understanding of diversity. Natasha says, I always used to design learning for the highest level of learner expected, not wanting them to be bored, but that changed to always design for the lowest and then add nice to knows and extra resources that could be accessed for those who want to know more. Absolutely. So diversity is expanding idea of, you know, who is in the room, what they come with, what they bring to the room, what they know and what they want to know. So definitely adding that to how we understand diversity, not just you know, who we see in front of us, but also who's not there and how we can bring them into the room. Does anyone want to contribute sort of a working definition of diversity or an example that they found interesting in their practice? Okay, in the interest of time, if you have anything to add, please drop it in the chat, and we'll also go through some insights in the Q&A session. So in terms of, you know, definition of inclusion. So in my mind, inclusion is a desired state. So we can approach it as the extent to which students feel a sense of belonging and value in a learning environment. So it's about us thinking about creating spaces where different people with different identities are being valued, given opportunities, and treated with respect. Obviously, diversity and inclusion are very closely linked, but an interesting insight that I learned from the Cambridge professor that I worked with is that diversity does not necessarily beget a feeling of inclusion. So even in learning environments where we have a diverse group of learners, some of them may not feel fully represented in terms of their voice being heard and their agency being exercised, and some of them may not feel they may not feel included as their full selves. So there are parts of themselves that they can share in the learning environment, or parts of themselves that they feel are valued, but other parts are not well represented, or perhaps are not taken seriously. I'm just checking the chat, and in the meantime, it looks like Mireille has something to contribute.
Yes, thank you. So if we think of inclusion and its opposite, we could consider exclusion and some of the ways that we design that inadvertently exclude students. So I remember someone had said language earlier. It's easy to design for language barriers if you know that you are designing for an international college, let's say, for example, and there's quite a wide range of diverse students who will be there. But generally, if we're designing for an English-based university or institution, we automatically assume that the attending student is a first language user. And I've, at least for the courses that I've designed, there has never been an opportunity to design language guides beyond kind of the basic glossary of terms for students who are second language users. And so it means that despite the fact that jargon and terminology may be explained, there may be other ways that we exclude second language users, like through metaphors or allegory and that kind of thing. It would be easy for a student to have to kind of battle and have that cognitive load of trying to figure out, what does this actually mean? I mean, I'm listening to myself now as I'm speaking, and I can hear all these like language isms creeping in. But for us, it would seem simple, but for a student trying to learn the primary concept and trying to get to grips with the language, immediately they will feel excluded. This is not part of my experience. This is not necessarily the way that I would explain this in my target language. And so simple things like that We could obviously talk about things like imagery that is being used. As a learning designer who has to search for graphics, I remember with a particular client, they were looking for a particular demographic to be represented in their stock images. And it was incredibly frustrating to find that demographic represented in a certain way, to the point where all of the other LDs on the same project, we sometimes overlapped with the images that we used because there were so few that were available. And something as simple as that, as finding an image of someone who represents the actual learner that you're designing for, becomes important, but you only notice it when you have to look for it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for your insight. I think your example around second language users is a great example for illustrating the difference between diversity and inclusion. So second language users, we know they're there. And as you say, we add in the glossary, for example. We try and, Tracy mentioned explaining idioms where we can. But for me, one of the things that could enhance inclusion is if you're a second language user, that implies that you have a different cultural background, for example, and how do we use examples from a variety or that represent a variety of backgrounds. So it's not just enabling you to engage with the course or the program as a second language user, but enabling you to engage with the course or the program as someone who has a different perspective they can either contribute, or someone who has a different perspective that could and should be represented. Case studies are an example. As you're saying, a variety of images is another example in use of graphics. Thank you so much. So quite a bit of discussion going on in the chat. Natasha, can diversity include access to resources, for example, access to the internet or knowledge of technology for those using online? Yeah, absolutely. So I think that is a nice connection point between diversity and inclusion. So again, we are aware that different students have different technological capabilities, barriers to entry, and those kinds of things. So it's not just about allowing them, finding ways for them to access the content. It's also leveraging those different tools that they use to get around some of their access issues. For example, if students are accessing content on a mobile phone, how do we leverage the advantages of mobile responsive content that works seamlessly with desktop content? Yeah, again, the point about idiomatic language, and Kole has an example. I might ask you to explain your example a little bit further in the Q&A session, Kole, just around being aware, not just that we need to explain terms as they're used, but also enrich that experience for second language speakers, make it metaphorical, make it add literary elements that don't just speak to first language speakers, but to second language speakers as well. So yeah, great, thank you so much, amazing contributions there. And then I'll just quickly move on to accessibility, and what do we mean by accessibility? What does it mean when we add accessibility into the mix? I'll be looking out for your comments in the chat, but as an organization, we had to grow quite rapidly and significantly in this area to make sure that we were really baking in best practice into all the programs that we design, and not just when clients come to us with accessibility requirements like WCAG. We see ourselves as thought partners for our clients, and for those who aren't really that advanced in the conversations around accessibility, we want to build the basics into everything we do, and create awareness where we can, so that even if accessibility requirements aren't legislated, for example, in the country, or if they haven't done a sophisticated level of audience analysis and identified the accessibility needs of their learners, we can still provide them a minimum product that has some of those accessibility best practices baked in there. So accessibility is the third sort of concept that I wanted to sort of connect with everyone on, and see if we're on the same page in terms of how we're thinking about things, how we define things. Just checking the chat to see if we have any contributions there around accessibility. So some of these are responses to points that have come up earlier. So just in the interest of time, just moving on quickly, we will park these for the Q&A session. Just quickly, KW52, I'm sorry, I don't know your name there. But speaking of accessibility, how does one access the chat profile? I'd like to input my name. So sorry about that. Tracy, if you can give instructions there.
I might divert to Cole on that because there is a way to do it in the chat profile to change your name. But at the moment, I am going to have to look it up and get back to you.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm sharing the screen, so I don't have all the functionality available to me.
Okay, yes, I'm happy to look into that as well. Let me take a look and get back to you, KW52.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so thank you again for sharing. If you have any questions, please allow me to park those. I'll go through the chat during our Q&A session. If anyone wants to bring up points that they've brought up but that hasn't been articulated with the group, I'm happy to do that. And then finally getting to our final question, how can we practice inclusive design? So I've been mining ideas from you, and I just want to end off by sharing a few areas that we can focus on, just so you can use as a launching point if you're finding things daunting, or if you're you know, for example, trying every tech tool in the book and things are still not landing for your learners. So just a bit of back to basics, I suppose. And these are some of the principles that our learning designers at Hubble Studios try to follow, regardless of, you know, the type of client or the type of project or the requirements that come with a certain project that we're dealing with at the time. So the first, you know, launching point is center the learner. You know, this bears repeating every time, but I hope our earlier conversations also made it clear that it's not just about the imagined or implied learner, but also that about the learner who should be in the room but cannot be for whatever reason. So just really encouraging us to expand the idea of who's in the room, who can't get into the room, and what can we do to allow as many people into the room as possible. You know, so if you need to remember my mom, working parent, 7 children, in her 50s, trying to do a correspondence course, or remember that student that that came to you with a challenge that changed your perspective or changed your approach to how you were delivering a course, how you were designing a course. Those learners are as important to center as the typical imagined learner that guaranteed this is the type of person that's going to be engaging with my course, or this is the person who's going to be walking into my classroom. So, you know, asking ourselves, how can we be an ally and a custodian for their inclusion? What kind of circumstances are they dealing with in terms of technology, pacing, resources, and, you know, the myriad other design decisions that we have to make. We also take very seriously the people-centered approach, which means we are also just as careful about reducing our learners to conditions, to diagnoses, to particular demographic categories, and we aren't afraid to change the decisions that we make in some instances when more information becomes available to us. Then creating 3-dimensional learning personas. Now, this is something that is quite typical in the learning design process. But you know, speaking specifically to the course design process, we need to explore how to get the most well-rounded picture of our broad learner base. And just to give you an example of, or an idea of how we approach this at Hubble, our learning personas actually start with an introduction or a profile of the learner and a description of their motivation for learning. And only then do we dive into demographics, qualifications, age and language and those kinds of things. We also make sure that we have more than one learning persona for a particular project, and typically it will range from 3 to 4 personas to encompass a range of the imagined learner, the non-typical learner, and various different, and even with the imagined learner, various different backgrounds and identities and perspectives that they're bringing to the course. So we try to cover, you know, the learner's general background, their age, their language proficiency, the education experience or relevant prior knowledge. We also try and look at how much time they can dedicate to a learning experience, which is a huge factor for my mom, for example. When and where the learning will happen, the learner's motivation or incentive to learn, which we can't take for granted. And then also things like accessibility considerations. Do they have internet access? Do they require a screen reader, etc.? Then next, another launching point that would be very useful for your design approach is using universal design for learning. Now, this is an instructional design model that seeks to create environments and contexts of learning that champion accessibility to a universal audience. By accounting for contextual factors associated with learners' identities, UDL aims to provide equal access and appropriate learning materials to diverse learners in order to render meaningful learning experiences. So you'll find plenty of resources online around guidelines for universal design learning, and they all center around engagement, representation, and action and expression. So these guidelines have been created to help us create a learner who is purposeful, motivated, resourceful and knowledgeable, and strategic and goal orientated, which is the dream, really. So looking into universal design for learning is another launch point that you can look at. And then finally, using multiple ways. So multiple ways is a core principle of inclusive design. And this includes giving students more than one option. And if more than one option is not available, giving them variety in their options. So these options could relate to, for example, communication options. If you're presenting content in a video, do you have captions? Do you have transcripts? Do you have graphics? Do you have alt text? Do you have an HTML element with no visible label? So with that one learning asset, the video, there are multiple ways you're communicating information or customizing the information that learners who are accessing that asset in different ways are exposed to, and that information is relevant to the way that they're accessing the asset. Another area that using multiple ways is super important is assessments. So assessments giving learners a variety of ways to demonstrate learning, to demonstrate competence. That's not just, it's not just productive for the learner, it's also fair. There are many things that we cannot design for, we cannot design around, and by giving learners those options, we're giving them the most equitable chance to demonstrate competence and to demonstrate their skills as possible. It's also, considering giving individual and group choice. So as a class, learners can choose a particular way to engage with content or to complete assessments, for example, and giving individuals that same choice, given whatever factors they're dealing with at the moment, and disclosure in giving them those choices is also super important. So just 4 areas that obviously there's a lot more detail that we could go into, but just in the time that we have, 4 areas to touch on if you need to get started taming the beast of diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. Yeah, that's me for today. I just wanted to wrap up in the Q&A session by sharing, anything insightful that you've learned from myself or others, anything that you wanted to hear more about, and anyone that you want to connect with for more information. And then I'll go through some of the chat comments too, if we have time. So anyone wants to share on what they've learned what they would have liked to hear more about, or anything they would like to connect with others around.
There's a few comments in the chat. If you all want to, can they unmute and just speak to what they had put in the chat?
Yeah, that would be great. So Mireli, you had a comment around maximizing contextual and instructional copy, using templates, for example. Do you want to explain a little bit more of that, or give us an example where that worked really well for you?
Yes, definitely. So the learning designer's responsibility is to, and this is something that I actually heard today, is to create a narrative through the course and through the concept. And so it may seem like everything is a disparate concept, but we really have to kind of build in that connective tissue. And so one way to catch the learner who may not be the ideal learner is to provide that contextual copy for them in simplified language that helps them to understand. Now that you have learned X, Y, and Z, this is how we are going to connect to the next concept. So really thinking about and maximizing your contextual copy. Why is it there? We're not using it to fill up space. It's to give them the bridge to cross over to the next concept. And simple things like instructional copy, it's easy to kind of overlook. Something as simple as navigational text. I've worked with faculty members who chose not to have navigational text because to their mind, students are going to click next anyway. But for some learners, they may have never used an LMS before, and they may not be ready to move on to the next concept because everyone has a busy life. They may need to step away. And so alerting the learner, when you select next, you will go to this page where you will do this thing and learn this thing. This helps to prepare them. Is this going to be a quick learning bite that I can consume really quickly? Or is it going to be an assignment that I need to submit? And so do I need to kind of pause, step away, come back? Something as simple as submitting an assignment. If they've never done it before on a new LMS, don't give them a barrier. Allow them to figure out how to submit that assignment. Something as simple as scroll up to the top of the page and click submit assignment. That kind of thing. It's really useful for students who have never used those platforms before. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Marily. So yeah, and again, it ties really nicely into the point about giving students a choice or multiple ways, because when you give students that instructional text, you're also giving them a choice in terms of how they navigate. So there are some, students who will happily click through, and some will prefer to use a spacebar for whatever reason. As you say, it also gives them the choice to park whatever they're doing and jump back into the learning. So really expanding the learner's experience. Thank you for that. I think it was Kim Walsh, KW52. Thank you for that, Tracy, who asked about resources, and Dr. Heather Brown has posted some links in the chat. I was going to post the CAST guidelines myself, so thank you for that, Heather Brown. Yeah, so James, so Richard, just to on your point around learning personas, yeah, super interesting. We use them quite extensively in our project, and it just, again, it gives you that opportunity to capture and make concrete in your mind who you're designing for beyond this age group, this particular demographic profile. So we found that extremely useful. It also helps us communicate better our design choices to clients and to for example, faculty who will end up delivering programs. There's quite a few comments in the chat. Anyone want to come off mute and just give a few final insights or parting thoughts? Okay, great. I'm just watching the clock there. So just wanted to wrap up and say thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you for listening. Thank you so much for your insights. Again, I was here to mine for information, and I really do feel like I've learned a lot from what everyone has shared. I hope you have also come out with a nugget or two that you can use in your practice, or that you can use to explain something a little bit differently, or think about something a little bit differently. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, I'm going to post in the chat.
Oh, sorry, Tracy, you're on mute again.
Hi. Okay, thank you, Nandipha, for a great presentation. I am going to post in an evaluation link in the chat if when you get a chance, if you're able to fill that out and send it in. Thank you all for joining.